As I was teaching a unit on World War I noticed many similarities between this event and current education policy. We teach students to remember the causes of World War I by remembering the acronym MAIN: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. These causes can be translated into problems with current education policy and the environment surrounding the debate on the future of education. In the years leading up to World War I, European powers demonstrated militarism by building up their armies and increasing public support for military endeavors. These actions fueled rivalries between countries and created an arms race in Europe. Today, policymakers arm themselves with standardized tests and attempt to justify their actions by saying the biggest threat to student achievement is teachers. This militarism is reflected in the increasing animosity toward teachers from government officials and private citizens and is fueled by companies looking to cash in on education budgets. In the face of rivalries on the European continent, countries sought to insulate themselves with alliances. Competing alliances led to a domino effect of war declarations after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Alliances between the government, charter schools, and companies producing tests, software, and other materials for schools pose a major conflict of interest between these companies and policymakers. Companies have received millions of dollars from state governments largely to produce material inferior to what teachers create for their own classrooms. These companies are major proponents of the big data infused into education policy as we attempt to quantify what is unquantifiable through standardized testing. More on that later. Another alliance that jeopardizes the well-being of public schools is the alliance between charter school proponents and many lawmakers. Charter schools have been promoted as alternatives to public schools, and supporters claim that their existence will promote competition, which will in turn encourage public schools to improve. Despite data showing that most charter schools are ineffective in improving student performance, stories of these schools cherry-picking students they accept and allow to continue in the school to inflate their performance, people continue to see them as a superior alternative to public schools. For companies producing educational materials and charter school entrepreneurs, tapping into public budgets is big business that robs public schools of resources. Imperialism was another source of friction between European countries as they sought to expand their empires throughout the world. In practice, these imperial powers stripped their colonial possessions of their resources for the benefit of the mother country and were operated without regard for or knowledge of those who lived there. K-12 education policy has been imperialized by those with no experience in schools. Experience as a student does not count. Having family members in education does not count. Some lawmakers claim credibility through their experience as a college professor, but the K-12 world and higher education are different animals. Education policy decisions have transferred from classroom teachers and school-based administrators to people whose only experience in education has been as a student. Some of these people propose a business approach to education, and many districts have sought out business leaders with no education experience to head their institutions. A business approach to teaching does not work. Our products are not widgets, they're people with basic needs, emotions, and thoughts. Education is not a business, it's a social institution. The growth of nationalism in Europe also led to World War I. The unification of countries such as Germany and Italy minimized local jurisdiction by centralizing power in national governments. The arrival of these new kids on the block disrupted the European balance of power and fueled rivalries for dominance in Europe. Nationalization of education policy has further eroded the role of those on the front lines in making decisions to help kids learn. Teachers have strived to leave no child behind long before legislation coined the phrase. However, we do not believe an emphasis on testing over teaching is the way to leave no child behind. No multiple choice test can measure critical thinking or creativity. By nature, these tests prioritize low-level thought processes at the expense of skills that have given the United States a reputation for its ingenuity. Race to the top is another national policy that demonstrates wrong-headedness in its attempt to improve education by collecting more scientifically invalid data, increasing the number of charter schools, and restructuring teacher evaluation systems to include data from scientifically invalid tests. The similarities between World War I and education policy today reach beyond the causes. The phrase "lions led by donkeys" was coined during World War I and highlights the disconnect between frontline soldiers and politicians. This disillusionment with the realities on the ground is the same perception that many teachers have of policymakers. The harshness of this phrase also highlights the resentment those on the ground feel at being left out of decisions that they have the most extensive qualifications to make. Education policy has shifted from localized decision-making within classrooms and districts to heavy state involvement beyond funding to the nationalization and commercialization of education. When you look at those making major policy decisions, members of boards of education, state lawmakers, national lawmakers, how many members have degrees in education? If you have a legal problem, you consult a lawyer. For a medical problem, you consult a doctor. So why is it that for issues in education, politicians make the decisions? It seems that people think that because they were a student, they know how to run a classroom. I've experienced surgery, but you don't want me conducting yours. Some politicians try to gain clout by citing family members who are teachers. My parents worked at the post office. Does that mean I should be Postmaster General? The premise of these practices seems to be that teachers cannot be trusted to improve student achievement. This premise is counterproductive. When soldiers in World War I spoke out against the horrors they witnessed as a result of incompetent decisions, they were labeled crazy or cowards and received treatment. When teachers speak out against policies that they believe harm students, they are labeled greedy or closed-minded. If I were greedy, I would not have become a teacher. Just because I disagree with you does not make me closed-minded. World War I became a war of attrition in which millions of men were sacrificed as they were ordered across no man's land to attack the enemy on what were essentially suicide missions. This happened repeatedly despite the losses, as military officials were pressured by politicians to do something. The stagnation of World War I was a practical result of battlefield logistics and trench warfare, but the politicians and the public were anxious to see action, and military officers were forced to oblige lest they lose their jobs. Any troops who did not follow orders across no man's land were labeled cowards at best and executed at worst. I don't mean any disrespect by comparing battlefield deaths in war to our public schools, but I believe this analogy fits what teachers experience in their classrooms. Pressure to do something comes from politicians, and the something they prescribe is throwing tests at our students. It does not matter that these tests do not align closely to the curriculum the teacher is assigned to teach, emphasize low-level skills, or are a snapshot of a student's ability. People want to see action, regardless of its value. Frontline troops experienced a variety of maladies during their time in the trenches. Trench foot is one infamous ailment which resulted from extensive time standing in waterlogged trenches. Our students are in the trenches with us. We observe students experiencing trench hand and trench bottom on standardized test days. Students may spend 4 hours each day for about a week sitting for tests, and this does not include numerous practice tests throughout the year. This begins in 3rd grade. Aside from the structure, content, and uses of standardized testing, one part that is often missing from the discussion is the practical implementation of standardized tests. As teachers, we know that it is poor practice to expect a student's undivided attention for more than twice the number of minutes as their age. This is especially true for younger students. How is it that this basic practical policy that teachers are expected to implement is so ignored on high-stakes testing days? To avoid participation in World War I battles, some soldiers would resort to feigning illness or injuring themselves to avoid futile missions. The few who returned from battle experienced a host of psychological issues associated with PTSD. Test anxiety is our students' PTSD. The results of World War I also parallel our current education policy-making environment. At the time, the war was known as the Great War and was sold as the war to end all wars. We now know that it only served to further polarize Europe. This polarization continues between teachers and policymakers. Just as World War I did not make progress in building a more cooperative European continent, current education policy has done little to make progress in improving student achievement. Our Treaty of Versailles comes in the form of hostile legislation disguised as accountability. Teachers today are experiencing the effects of a war guilt clause. The assumption is that if a student does not succeed, it is the teacher's fault. This has created a chain of policies that focuses on teachers, not on students. One policy popular among lawmakers and the public includes the elimination of tenure. One major misconception about tenure is that it keeps ineffective teachers in classrooms. This is not true. Tenure is not immunity from dismissal, it is due process. What is wrong with tenure is not its existence, but the casual way in which it is granted by many administrators. Teachers these days feel like they're treated like a dime a dozen. While there are many people who hold teaching certificates, good teachers are not a dime a dozen. If the attitude taken toward teachers when they disagree with policy is, if you don't like it, get a different job, why are administrators so reluctant to deny an ineffective teacher tenure in favor of seeking out a more effective one? Given the culture of freely distributing tenure, there are tenured teachers who are ineffective and need to be removed from classrooms. Unfortunately, some administrators don't want to go through the paperwork and uncomfortable conversations to remove the tenured teacher. I don't want to work with ineffective teachers any more than you want your child to be in their classroom. However, revoking the idea of tenure for all teachers to avoid straightforward conversations with individuals who are ineffective is spineless. Tenured teachers are more likely to advocate for their students, even if it means disagreeing with their administrators or policymakers. Tenure empowers me to share my concerns. Shutting teachers out of the discussion by incentivizing silence is not a policy that will help our students make progress, and is precisely the reason tenure has traditionally been issued in education. Another key policy that lawmakers have pushed to improve education is to increase teacher accountability through standardized testing. Aside from the fact that many tests do not closely mirror the curriculum and are outsourced to companies looking to cash in on education budgets, standardized testing in and of itself produces invalid data. No scientific experiment would be deemed valid with so many uncontrolled variables that go into student performance. Policymakers insist that there is a causal relationship between a teacher's teaching and a student's test performance. This ignores other variables such as a student's socioeconomic status, home life, nutrition, sleep, work ethic, and parental involvement. Policymakers dismiss this point as an excuse. These variables are not excuses. They are the reality of what influences educating a child. Dismissing these variables is irresponsible, and addressing them should be part of the discussion to improve student achievement. I wish for my students that their experience in my classroom was the only variable affecting their education. I am an effective teacher. Unfortunately, my work with them for an hour each day is not the only thing going on in their lives which affects their achievement. The war on education has turned into a war on teachers and, by default, students. It results in making teaching an unattractive profession and schools a more stressful place for students. I don't doubt that our policymakers are trying to do what's best for students, but vilifying teachers and neglecting them from the creation of policies will only prolong the stalemate of improving student achievement. Dialogue, trust, and humility needs to be restored among all stakeholders. It's time we try again with a clean slate.